Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. As the black media, we've always told you that anti-black racism is a group sport. But to continue the sports analogy, just because the players are on the same team doesn't mean that they all wear the same uniform. The white supremacists discovered a long time ago the necessity of making sure that you don't always lend a white face to the imposition of white supremacy. You need to make sure that there are some non-white faces out there. If you want to prop up a system of oppression for the long haul, you gotta make sure that the oppressors remain a moving target. That means you gotta bring in some people from outside the oppressor class in order to run interference for the oppressor class. For that higher level white supremacist, the ones who pull strings all the time, the ones who are in charge. You want to make sure that you only put yourself out there if you absolutely need to. That way, you confuse the issue. People are pointing at whoever your sock puppet straw man is that you got out there, your front person, and they're not looking at you. And then you can claim that you've got all kinds of support for your asinine racist movement that you don't actually have. This is one of the games that they play. They're virtuosos when it comes to being able to use their sock puppets. Straw man plaintiffs, that's just one way that white supremacy has some flunky that it uses as a stalking horse. I've told you before about Amy Chua. She considers herself to be a slightly more sanitized version of Michelle Malkin. Basically, she thinks that she's less obnoxious, so that makes her better. This is a distinction without a difference in my book. She's an apologist for white supremacy and engineered economic inequality. Show me a country where there's economic oppression, particularly based on race or ethnicity, and I'll show you a country that Amy Chua will make excuses for, just so long as you're not talking about China. She has tons of praise for that, well, just not for the Chinese Communist government, that's all. Just not for the guys who run the place. As Neely Fuller told you, white supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. Now, as you'll probably recall, Amy Chua was the belle of the white media ball for her book, Hymn of the Tiger Moms. Everyone from the Wall Street Journal to Good Morning America were heaping praise on her. It seemed all the white media had more or less fallen in love with Amy Chua. They just couldn't seem to say enough good about her. And she couldn't say enough about how her Chinese parents had instilled in her an absolutely fanatical love of nose to the grindstone and make sure that you have achievements such as MD this, PhD that, etc., etc. But the main talking point that Amy Chua was pushing, the gist that the white media left and right loved her for so much, was that she was saying that people who happen to be of elite status, especially when it comes to economics, people who are at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, well, they're there because they're smarter and because they work harder. And she was not saying this in an Anglo-Saxon context because everybody knows that race would immediately come into the conversation. She instead was saying, well, I'm saying this is somebody who's of Chinese heritage, so you can't accuse me of white supremacy, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and the white media ate that up. Left and right, they all loved it. Juju Chang of ABC, who's on her own personal jihad to try to see if she can free the convicted serial rapist Daniel Holtzclaw, she's another black-hating journalist, and she gushed about Amy Chua's book when it debuted. This was all the thin end of the wedge. They were trying to find a sneaky way to push their talking point that race isn't an impediment to success in America. But everybody knows what the unspoken meaning of that actually is. What you're actually saying is it's not race that doesn't exist, it's white supremacy that doesn't exist. It is the system of goodies, giveaways, and guarantees handed to those classified as white that they receive simply because they've been classified as white at the expense of black people. That's what doesn't exist. That's how Barack Obama could stand in front of the world like a braying idiot and say, there is no black America, there is no white America, only the United States of America. The United States is a racial pyramid scheme, with those classified as white at the top and those classified as black at the bottom. This racial pecking order is artificial, engineered, no different than a bar of soap or a scripted TV drama. It is understood that the racial pecking order must not be changed or even disturbed. It's also fully understood that there's only a few token positions that will be given to non-whites, but only if they repeat the lie that race doesn't matter. This was why Amy Chua became a flash-in-the-pan sensation with the white media. Elitism is not based on political leanings. Not in this country it isn't. It's not left or right. It's race. That's how the society is structured, not on class, but race. So everyone fully understands that whenever somebody says, there's no systemic inequality in this country, what they're actually saying is, there is no anti-black racism in this country. You're defending the racial status quo, which means white remains at the top and black is forced to the bottom. And the white media, as well as every other arena of the society, will be tripping over themselves to praise you if you do that. They'll give you a book deal and, in the case of Obama, even the presidency, if they think you'll be a reliable and convincing mouthpiece for what is the biggest of lies. Now, Amy Chua didn't go whole hog with the apologizing for white supremacy and tiger moms, but she didn't have to. White supremacy can read between the lines. They understood where this could go. And the white media's celebratory coverage emboldened Chua and her husband. Now they felt like they could be much more direct with their next book, and they wouldn't make the mistake that Charles Murray did with the bell curve. They would be more careful than he was. However, Chua and hubby stuck their necks out a tad too far in 2014 when they wrote their follow-up book, The Triple Package: How Three Unlikely Traits Explain the Rise and Fall of Cultural Groups in America. First problem with that is, the United States is not based on cultural groups, based on racial classifications. So the title itself is a lie. And on top of that, in their own book, that's exactly what they admit. The book says that it's about the rise and fall of cultural groups, but when you actually open up and read it, it's nothing but racial groups. And to use the term cultural as a euphemism for racial, that's right out of the right-wing playbook. But here you have a woman who's supposed to be a Yale professor and her husband too. These supposed to be people on a leftist liberal campus, and yet they are operating out of the exact same lexicon as the alt-right. Trying to use culture in place of the word racial, you're not going to fool anyone with that ploy. But even if you were dumb enough to try to take race out of the discussion, the title of the book is still a lie. What group in the United States has fallen? That's what I want to know. The country is 245 years old. So what group in this country has fallen? What group fell? What group has been doing great in this country but has now fallen? Who? This country's entire purpose has been to permanently freeze the social order in place. Nobody goes anywhere in this country. The social pecking order has not changed. It's remained frozen for 245 years. As Dr. Claude Anderson explained, especially when it pertains to black people, wealth distribution in this country is no different now than it was on the eve of the Civil War. So what group in this country has seen their condition fall? Likewise, what group has seen their position rise? This book and its putrid talking points are straight out of the bell curve. Chua peddles the same racist pseudoscience and bigoted crackpot theories as Charles Murray. The difference being Chua remembered what happened to Murray in the 90s, and so she and her husband tried to use Nigerians as their own personal rhetorical shield to hide behind. Chua's entire thesis is that Asians are far more successful than black people on average, which proves that the country isn't institutionally racist, but that black people simply don't want to work, or that black people have cultural failings. Chua and her husband already knew that people would call them out on their racist nonsense because we've seen this rhetorical racist sleight of hand before, so this time she thought that she would be clever by naming 8 groups. East Asians, of which she just happens to be a member, Indians, Jews, who her husband happens to be Jewish, Lebanese, Mormons, Nigerians, Persians, and Cubans. Now, what do those groups have in common? What they have in common is none of their numbers are large enough or politically active enough to be a threat to white supremacy. That's the first problem. You're not finding an East Asian threat to white supremacy in the United States, which is the seat of white supremacy. So she didn't just choose those groups offhand. She and her husband chose those groups for a reason. But the second thing that needs to be noted is she listed Cubans in the group, and she was relying on information from Ruben Rambat. Chua was pointing out that Cuban Americans come to the U.S. and look at Marco Rubio and, oh, the Cuban Americans, they've got it all figured out, and if they can do it, there's no excuse for black people. Well, in their over-enthusiastic zeal to try to list some non-white groups so that they could give themselves rhetorical cover for their racist anti-black hate tract, they completely ignored what Mr. Rombat wrote. One of the things that he published in one of his papers was that he had found that in Miami public schools, it's Cuban youth who have the highest dropout rate. Higher than white students, higher than black students. You go to Miami public schools, and it's the Cuban youth, Cuban immigrant children who have the highest dropout rate. But of course, Miss Chua didn't list that in her book. She didn't mention that because this was not about mentioning facts. This was about manufacturing a narrative and cherry-picking whatever information you could to prop up that narrative. Amy Chua's attempt to be a more sanitized version of Charles Murray fell flat on its face. Hell, even other Asians felt that they had to call her out because it was so ridiculously obvious that what she was saying was a lie. The only people who believed the tripe that Amy Chua wrote in the triple package, the only people who that kind of garbage will appeal to are people who already believe it. Anyone who actually tries to examine that nonsense would immediately see that it wasn't true. Claiming that the immigrants start businesses and their children are more likely than native-born Americans to go to college, etc. The reason for this? Chua says the immigrants are successful because they come from cultures that emphasize hard work and the value of education. They just understand it better and they're willing to try harder. Which of course begs the question, if they already had all the traits needed for success in their home countries, why were they not able to do it there? If their culture was the reason why didn't it work in their home countries? The second that Amy Chua says, well, because of the Chinese Communist Party, yeah, there you go. So Chinese culture did not give rise to massive rampant education and people working harder than everyone else. It gave rise to the Chinese Communist Party. And if Amy Chua comes from a country whose culture prohibits the rewards of hard work or doesn't allow personal success, then what does that say about Amy Chua's culture? Well, what it says is Amy Chua is not going to say anything about it, and the white media is not going to bring it up either. To show you how Chua didn't actually do any real research, consider this. Chua and her husband scribbled out their little book, The Triple Package, in 2014. Now, one would think that they had spent at least a year working on it. After all, these two are supposed to be Yale-educated scholars, right? So when they say immigrants and their children do better in school and earn more money than the rest of the society, they wouldn't be pulling that out of their behinds. It would have to be based on something, right? Wrong. Pew Research published a study a year before Chua's little propaganda piece was put into print, and in it, Pew Research did what Chua never did: research. They actually looked at how first and second generation immigrants perform in the U.S. compared to the native-born population. And what a surprise, they found that the first-generation immigrants' median income was less than native-born Americans. And as for that second generation of immigrants, their income was almost exactly the same. The reverse was true for poverty. First-generation immigrants were more likely to be in poverty than native-born Americans. And the second generation had a poverty rate about the same as native-born populations. College graduation rates for second-generation immigrants weren't much higher than native-born. The problem Amy Chua has is the problem all propagandists have. They start off with their crackpot conclusions first, and then try to cherry-pick information that they think will support it, rather than follow the actual data. But then again, they can't afford to follow the data because they already know that the data would prove them to be liars. But she didn't write this book to convince anyone of anything. It was deliberately written to preach to the choir. Gotta keep those home fires burning, you know. Now, Chua had become something of a media darling for a couple of years because of the Tiger Moms book and even the controversy revolving around the triple package, but you'll notice that in the last 5 or 6 years or so, white media ain't been talking about her so much. And there's a good reason for that, because the coverage that Amy Chua and her husband have been getting for the last couple of years has been anything but flattering. Chua and her husband have been embroiled in a number of on-campus scandals at Yale, all of them of their own making. In 2019, Chua got herself reprimanded after it was found that she would invite her law students to her home, ostensibly to put them on the fast track to be law clerks for federal judges. This is why you go to the Ivy League schools, by the way. It's not about book learning, it's about networking. So Chua made it a point to be drinking and socializing with her students at her home, and apparently this led to some misconduct, according to the allegations leveled against her. Chua had promised to stop hosting these private get-togethers, and Yale made Chua pay what they called a substantial financial penalty, though that amount has never been disclosed. Well, whatever the amount was, it couldn't have been too substantial, because in March 2020, students brought new allegations against Chua that she was still hosting these private drinking parties with students. She was removed from Yale's clerkship committee. Yes, Yale has an entire committee devoted solely to getting their graduates into federal clerkships, and she is no longer allowed to lead those small groups. So that's what's going on with Amy Chua right now, and things are even worse for her husband, Jeb Rebenfield. He wound up getting himself caught up in a scandal of a more serious nature. He's been accused of sexual harassment of students, unwanted touching, comments, etc. Yale conducted an investigation of the sexual misconduct claims against Jed Rubenfield, and while Yale University has refused to say what the results of their investigation of Jed Rubenfield have been, they did, however, announce that they were suspending him from the faculty for the next 2 years, and that they would restrict his interaction with students upon his return. You know, this is all very ironic to me because on the cover of their book, Chua and Rubenfeld have the words superiority plus insecurity plus impulse control equals the triple package. And yet here we see them over and over again, completely and thoroughly unable to stop themselves from inviting young people over to their home. And in the case of Rubenfeld, allegedly unable to stop himself from putting his hands on the female students or making sexual advances towards them. This is what these two do over and over again. Say, weren't these the two who put the word impulse control as one of the 3 elements of the triple package that they feel the ethnic groups that they belong to have in greater proportion than anyone else? Rather than showing the superiority of the groups that they belong to, instead they become an embarrassment to their groups. We've got so much impulse control. We have impulse control. Sure can't tell by looking. So, as we see, the biggest lie to come from Chua and Rubenfeld's fiction books has been Chua and Rubenfeld, and the phony front of pretending to be superior to everyone else. Their little superiority racket that the white media was eating up so much, well, as with all lies, it all comes crashing down. Now that the 2 self-congratulatory fools who wrote this exercise in psychological masturbation have been predictably exposed and disgraced, what are we to do with their pathetic little book now? Given that it's nothing more than a punchline, what are we to make of the triple package now? At this point, all you've got left are delusions of superiority, plus a lot of psychological insecurity and absolutely no impulse control. Well, maybe they can rename their book The Double Package. Amy Chua and her husband are finding out the hard way what black people have known all along, that when white supremacy is done with its tools, it always breaks its tools. So this is what's become of the Tiger Mom and her husband. Well, as Amy and Jed have spent so many years telling us, it must be their culture that's to blame. Good day, and be one.